Okay, so our presenters tonight, Cindy Thieman and Brian Bair. So Cindy has worked for watershed councils for over 20 years. We're probably at about 21 or 22 here now. And she's implemented everything from small and large scale habitat restoration projects, running watershed monitoring programs. And here she is now at the Hood River Watershed Group. And she holds a master's in biology from the University of Oregon and a secondary master's in community and regional planning. And she has even done some graduate teaching with limnology, freshwater biology, and plant physiology courses. And when she is not working, she enjoys her time gardening, hiking, and playing with her husband and 2 kids. So that is our friend Cindy. And then Brian Bair is the Watershed Restoration Projects Lead for the Enterprise Program at the U.S. Forest Service. He actually started the Watershed Restoration offering for the Enterprise Program in 2007. And since then has devoted, or before then and since then, has devoted his career to watershed and aquatic habitat restoration. He's worked throughout the United States. I've particularly enjoyed hearing about his work in Alaska on the Copper River, but it's expanded to Florida, Maine, Hawaii, and beyond. He works on inception, implementation, topographic surveys, alternative assessment, conceptual designs, on and on and on. He has a BS in biology from Montana State. And he started off on the Flathead National Forest and has migrated to the Columbia River Gorge to windsurf, not an uncommon story. And then to work on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and has sort of progressed from there. Let's see, let's make sure I'm not missing. There's a lot here. He is very well versed, is the long story short. When he's not working on rivers, he is usually windsurfing, foiling, paddleboarding, or fishing on them. And most importantly, Brian is a new grandpa and loves spending time with his family, dogs, and camping with his significant other, Tina. So thank you both for being here, and we're excited to hear about this project.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, Cindy.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Yep. Thanks for reminding me that I'm the one that starts off on this. Okay. So we did this project, just finished it up in August of this year, started it in July. It's the West Fork Hood River Habitat Project near Red Hill, where Red Hill Creek comes in. And it was a collaborative project developed in partnership with the tribes, the Watershed Group, and the Forest Service, both the Hood River Ranger District staff, Catherine Arndt in particular, and also the Enterprise Program with Brian as the lead there, and a number of his staff, including Corinne, and Brian, pipe in Corinne, I'm not remembering Corinne's last name.
Heidi Klingel.
Heidi Klingel, okay. And you had a couple other engineers, I think, that weighed in on it earlier on, but yeah, a fantastic design team from the Forest Service that helped us a lot. So the purpose of the project was to restore aquatic habitat, to help with recovery of spring Chinook, salmon, and summer steelhead and coho within the whole Hood River watershed. And Brian is going to take it from here, and I will chime in on a couple of the slides. So take it away, Brian.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to give a special thanks to Catherine Arndt and Darcy and Cindy and Alex. You know, I get to do the fun stuff, the design and actual implementation. And those guys get to do the no fun stuff, which is the permitting and funding part. But anyway, did a fantastic job, made our lives really easy, and feel really good. I think we have a really pretty awesome project. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of the history because this project deserves it. I mean, part of the reason we're doing restoration is what happened to it. And most of the tribs within the Columbia River, the logging started in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and really got with it around 1910. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, this group in particular, and really it's in vogue, kind of taking the watershed approach. But honestly, the first foresters, they took a watershed approach. And this is a picture of the Upper Wind River. This was taken in like 1942 by the Department of War. But it's showing kind of the progression of logging. And if you look over here, this is Dry Creek. Can you guys see my cursor at all?
Yes, they can. Yep.
Okay, good. So anyway, this is Dry Creek, but this is just beginning. So they would start by going up these tributaries. This is the main stem Wind River. And then
I
they
take
would,
that back, Brian. They can't see your cursor.
oh, well, how do I do this then? How about now?
Yeah, now you can. Yep.
Okay. All right. So anyway, this is Dry Creek. They would start by logging the riparian stream corridor, and then they would work up to the ridge tops. And they would bring all the material down. You can kind of see this. This is an old railroad line. They would put the railroads in, and these railroads would take things to the splash dam. So there were reservoirs built behind a series of splash dams where they would store the logs. And then they usually had most of the major tributaries also splash dammed or dammed, and they would release the water all at once. And so quite an efficient way to transport logs back then. These would all get flushed down to the Columbia River, where little tugboats and stuff would collect them and then take them to the mills and make rafts out of them. But not a really awesome thing for aquatic habitat or fish or any critters. One cool thing, I don't know how well you guys can see this, but up here by my cursor, this is a man, a human. And they used to have people staged along the river, and this guy would rappel down. So if any logs would get jammed up here, his job was to kind of pry them off of the log. Of course, this is before OSHA. So I love this picture. This is taken in 1913 below a splash dam. Apparently splash dams are great places to fish too, because they were migration barriers. But I want you to really, really focus and pay attention to this picture. And so number one, the one thing I want you to pay attention to, these are steelhead. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Next thing I want you to pay attention to are the people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So who in this picture do you think did not get the fish? Probably this person. And then who in this picture do you think was probably her husband? Probably this dude. Like, oh God, the drive home's gonna suck. Okay, so just kind of give you a picture of the scale of this. This is on the Willamette River. And I can't remember the year that this was, but this just kind of gives you an idea of how many board feet and how many riparian areas were logged throughout the Pacific Northwest. And this all happened really from 1900 through to about the end of the 30s. Dynamite. This was 1915 article, and in this has a number of pretty comical quotes, but the one that really got me is crooked streams are a threat to life and crops. And dynamite wasn't only used to straighten streams, but it was used extensively in the West Fork, in Hood River, in Wind River. And it was because of splash damming. They would try to make those channels as efficient as they could. Then we came back from World War II with some really awesome toys named cats. Bulldozers. This is just up and over the hill on Still Creek. This was right after the 1964 floods, series of large floods. So they yarded out all the merchantable material, sent that to the mill, burned the rest, and then bulldozed the streams straight, and then levied them also to reduce floods. This is zigzag, same thing. The Sandy River, just about every single, the Hood River, most of these channels all been bulldozed, starting in the 60s even until then the first fish biologists showed up on the scene, and they too bought into that log jams and wood are bad. And this gentleman right here was one of the first fisheries biologists in Region 6. These gentlemen here are volunteers from local fly fishing country. Of course, this guy's taking pictures of their hard-working efforts. This gentleman's using a chainsaw, and they used to do a practice is called debris jam notching. And so what that entailed was basically cut a big hole in the log jam. And this was in the same file with those other pictures. And I'm certain those guys were all sitting around on the logs, drinking beer, patting themselves on the back and thinking, wow, we just really helped the fish out here. Well, 10 years later, this was the old channel that went into this beautiful old growth channel. But now what happened, you can see the remnants of their notching. So after they notched the jams blew out, and then the streams down cut. This one down cut about 6 to 8 feet here. So leaving a lot of the old floodplain and old side channels and everything else high and dry, in addition to causing some severe erosion. So we went from this beautiful, kind of these log jams and mature riparian areas to situations like this. So totally down cut from the old floodplains, high bank instability, lots high sediment load. This is the West Fork, same deal, down cut. The old floodplain is up in here, dominated with alder. This is in Alaska, same deal, except super high sediment load. And then when you're in gravel beds channels, these just become highly unstable. Alder's relatively shallow rooted and isn't even close to the bank stability that Doug fir and other conifers have. Well, then in the 80s, people figured out that, hey, wood is good, and we do need wooden streams, but unfortunately, it came in the way of highly engineered lug structures. There was a whole series of them. There was a Army Corps of Engineers manual, 1974, that came out, had a bunch of these. This was a V-weir, they had K-dams, they had all these different things. So there would either be, they build these things and put chain link fence and all sorts of other things and boulders and things trying to hold them in. But in most cases, they had notched the log jams or taken them out, and the streams were actively down cutting. So most of these got undermined and went high and dry or just end around. Then in the early 90s, late 80s, soil bioengineering became kind of a real fad or trend. And this process was basically to lay the banks back, use coconut mesh fiber, willow cuttings and willow wattles and everything else. And then, that probably worked really good back east in low gradient areas, but out here in the Pacific Northwest, where we have rain on snow events and much higher velocities, it was not very successful. Then came along a guy named late 80s, early 90s, guy named Dave Rosgan. And Rosgan actually was a Forest Service hydrologist in Montana, over on the Madison Ranger District. But when he retired, he had a very successful career in river restoration. And he was one of the first ones to really bring science into river restoration and really got people thinking about natural processes and actually what you're doing. And he quickly became kind of a cult following of sorts. And you had a lot of people like the Rosganians and the Rosganishis that just really everything he did, you know, they just worshiped. Then you had the other side that did not really like Dave all that much, mostly because he's pretty flamboyant, but didn't like a lot of his methods or processes and things like that. I myself kind of really in the middle. I really thank him for really kind of jump starting and bringing science to the watershed restoration field. And I think, honestly, he's one of the reasons we are where we are today. But in the early 90s, a lot of the structures, the hard engineering stayed in there. These are kind of your typical Rosgan structures. I think this is a J-hook or a, I don't know, a bend-away weir or whatever they call them. But, you know, using class 6 riprap, I mean, these are size of rock that you're putting in here will basically never move. It might get buried with sediment. And then, so there was a lot of weirs and a lot of rock work and trying to create pools and things like that, which all good. But then came the fad of the engineered log jams. And again, these highly engineered kind of log structures, you know, mostly usually to protect banks and things like that. And again, scour pools. And then it kind of started evolving where people started, you know, trying to work with the channel morphology and introducing wood, but they were still cabling it to boulders and other things and kind of not very natural approaches. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, really people, including myself, really started expanding more of looking at, you know, the whole stream corridor restoration. Instead of just looking at the low flow channel, really looking at the floodplain, the old, you know, the whole enchilada and taking it on a reach and floodplain approach, which is also what we did with Red Hill. So instead of just looking at kind of the low flow channel, and then it evolved to eventually working with the bankful channel. Now we're really looking at from valley wall to valley wall, the whole thing when is the most current and really the most beneficial approach to aquatic resources right now. So the first thing we did with Red Hill is now in the 2020s, we have some really awesome computers and we have some awesome computer programs, one of which is called HEC2D, which was originally developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. And what HEC-RES can do is you can put in a variety of flows and see if you're going to flood anybody out or, you know, where the flood flows exist. In our case, this was our existing condition model, and we were looking at a number of different things, but this kind of dark purplish, that's kind of the normal Q2, like a normal winter flow type area. And then these lighter colors over here, these are the Q100. So these are the biggest flows. So immediately this is telling us that this stream has really down cut. These flow paths here are the historic old relic channels that were active before the splash damming occurred through this channel. So the next thing we're looking at is how feasible or how much do we have to try to bump the stream channel up to reactivate this, or is it even possible to do that? Some of which, in a lot of cases, it's just too far down cut. You'd have to fill the channel by 10 feet. Fortunately for us, that was not the case. Most of the down cutting here was around on an average of 6 feet, which sounds like a lot, but in general, even if we could bring this 2 to 3 feet up and then do some excavation in these side channels, we could get water back in it. The other thing these models look at, which I won't go into gory detail on, is velocity. So this really helps us out where we're actually thinking about reintroducing log jams. These darker areas you see here are the highest velocities. So if you're going to put a log jam here, this indicates that you really need to be aware. It's going to really take it on the chin. These other lighter blue areas, these are areas where much lower velocities and your risks are much lower.
And Brian, would you say that those dark red areas are, if you're going to put a log jam there, you have to provide another place for the water to go.
Yes.
So it's not all slamming into only the log jam.
Right, that's a good point. So there's a couple different ways you can deal with the dissipation of energy, and one of the best ways is to pop it up onto the floodplain, and that usually makes it much more kind and gentle. So our phase 3 project area began at the confluence of Red Hill Creek and West Fork, and then went upstream around 1,500 feet. And our primary goals and objectives were to reconnect about 1,400 feet of relic side channels and construct, we were anticipating 5 main stem tree boulder structures and excavating some of the side channel entrances and berms. In addition to these large wood structures, we were also gonna nuke the berms that were created by the bulldozing or splash damming or some combination of both. So just to kind of give you an idea of how this works. So this cross section here, again, this is the HEC-RAS model, and Heidi Klingel, awesome hydrologist, put this cross section through here. So this is station 0, so right around here. You can see the terrace, and then this is station 435 approximately, which is on the other end. But anyway, so, cutting these, why we did this is we were really interested in getting water in this floodplain over here in this old channel. And so we used that, and sure enough, yep, there's a little berm right there. So basically, we needed to know if we took this berm out, and then if we raise this bed elevation X feet, what flows would head into this channel. So that was kind of the basis of our whole design on this project. On all these, there were 3 main side channels that were water. And then Cindy, you want to kind of take off from here. What we ended up, I'll just say really quickly, is that we ended up with actually designing 6 structures instead of 5. We added one here at the end, mostly because we had a bit of a change in our project area. And I'll just say really quickly, these lines that are contiguous, these are areas where we actually did some excavation to some extent. These little dotted or broken lines are where they're just active side channels where we had to do nothing at all, basically. And then the red stars are where we had these main channel structures.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add a few more details on the project. So like Brian mentioned, the main channel treatment was about 1,500 feet. So, that is the blue line, which is the West Fork Hood River, and the yellow lines, the solid and dashed lines, are the side channels. And that it ended up being about 1,600 feet of side channel reconnection. And through the project, we actually also added about 300 feet of main channel. And you'll see that in a few more slides when Brian shows pictures of the project, how we actually got a little bit more stream length by adding meanders to the river, the main river itself. So just to, kind of pull back and realize that by doing these projects, installing these main channel structures and reconnecting and doing some excavation in the fill in these historic side channels, we more than doubled the length of aquatic habitat in this stretch of the West Fork. So you're more than doubling aquatic habitat. And the thing that I really have learned over the past couple of years in developing these projects with our partners and developing the action plan is really thinking about, how are we diversifying the habitat in this restoration reach? So I think you'll see in the pictures that it starts out, the channel is very coarse. So it has a lot of boulders in it. it looked very similar. It was all kind of one fairly steep riffle that was about a 4% grade, not very little pool habitat, and not very hospitable to juvenile steelhead or juvenile spring chinook. So keeping in mind that we have juvenile steelhead hang around in the watershed for at least 2 years. So that's 2 years on average. So they're spending a lot of time, and they need the right velocities, especially when they're early stage juvenile, like in their first 6 months to a year. They're needing quieter waters, sort of this off-channel habitat that we're always talking about. And so these side channels are really important when the spring chinook and the summer steelhead are coming up to spawn. Once they hatch out after several months, they need to get off the channel during high flow events, or even to get away from predators, from the larger juvenile coho or juvenile steelhead, let's say the year ones or the year twos steelhead. So the complexity, we're always talking about habitat complexity, and that is really why, that's the biological basis for why it's so important that we have side channel habitat. And so Brian's going to point out these pictures of pools in some of these side channels. So altogether in the side channels, there were 4 pools that were actually created as kind of part of the construction process. And then associated with each of these red stars, which were, these red stars aren't a single, they're a series of structures, usually with kind of one really big structure that raises the bed elevation, so that the water kind of elevates to the same level of the side channel entrance. So it's sort of a kind of bringing the main channel up, and then also bringing the side channel entrance down to kind of split the difference, so that you get water going into those side channels even in the summer. Altogether, we had about 220 pieces of large wood, or the sort of trees with root wads. They almost all the wood that we used had root wads still attached, and approximately 140 came from a Forest Service stockpile. And I think it's kind of interesting for folks listening who might remember that the Mount Hood Meadows had added a new parking lot to their Hood River Meadows area, and I think it was called the Twilight parking lot, perhaps. And the Forest Service, with foresight, told the contractor, we want you to push over all of those trees, and then they staged them. They put them in a stockpile so that they would have trees with root wads still attached for projects like these. So about 140-ish trees came from that stockpile, and then the remaining 80 or so were pushed over on site. And some of those, you can see the white line is where the excavator came in. Aquatic Contracting was the company that did the work. And so they started the project by, the top end of this picture, the white line, kind of coming in, and they were able to follow, use the historic side channel, which was already going to be disturbed to reconnect these side channel habitats. So they were able to use that, pioneered kind of the route in. Along the way, there were some trees that they were able to push over, since it was going to be a path anyway. They pushed those trees over to use in the project. And I want to do a shout out to EcoTrust Forest Management, because they were the private landowner you can see actually on the right side of this aerial photography, that kind of the right third or quarter of it, that it looks like it's experienced some logging. And so it used to be Weyerhaeuser land, and that was sold. They sold it to EcoTrust Forest Management, who for for lack of a better term, a sort of a green forest management company. They're really great to work with, and they were great partners. So they really provided the access to the Forest Service land that this project took place on. And they also donated the trees that were in the access route on their property. So really appreciate that they were such, great cooperators and donated those trees, and were just all around great to work with. So 220 trees, over doubled the, the total length of aquatic habitat. I think those were the highlights that I want, kind of big picture for this project. So Brian, if you want to take it from here.
Okay. And I think Cindy brought up a really good point. One of the probably biggest benefits for aquatic resources is the off-channel winter habitat, especially for coho, to some degree, Chinook, and even Steelhead a bit. But this section of stream was not a very, well, no, it was a very hostile place in the winter. Not a lot of places for the fish to hide. This is a look at kind of the typical process or the structures that we're building now. There's no cable in with these or anything else. These are what we call emulated landslide deposits. So this upstream, we're looking upstream, and this is near side channel 3. These structures go into the terrace and they go well above the Q100 elevation, which is, I think, if you can see my cursor, somewhere about right here. And there's,
and Brian, tell them what Q100 means for those.
oh, I'm sorry. So that would be your 100-year flood, 1 in 100 chance. Every year you're going to have a 100-year, they call them 100-year flood, but it's really a probability. It's 1 in 100 chance, which we seem to be having 1 in 100 every couple of years now. So, but anyway, these are designed to do a couple different things. Number one, the structure extends all the way over through the valley and helps bring the stream channel up. There's a side channel over here, so the stream comes in. Some of the flow is cut off into here, less than 20%. And then this is also, this structure intrudes kind of similarly into the stream for 2 different reasons. Number one, also trying to reduce the slope of this. I think this was almost 7 or 8% through here. And so by doing this, you're introducing kind of a mini meander. So you're helping reduce velocities. You're giving a place for additional wood and sediment to accumulate on these forming bars, and also introducing flow into the side channel. This is looking downstream. So that uppermost landslide deposit, basically the little drone is hovering kind of right above it. You can see water. This is side channel. I don't know what we called it. Kind of one
connector between, it's a connector between side channel 2 and 3.
Right. And also side channel 2 comes out just off the screen. What was kind of cool about this is when we excavated this as well, we intercepted, we knew there was quite a bit of groundwater, but man, it really, as soon as we got down to the elevation of the historic channel, we just had a lot of groundwater, which is really double cool because this is a glacially fed stream. So we're also going to be creating clear water habitat in certain sections of this. So another great place for the fish to run up and hide. But anyway, again, looking downstream, and again, just trying to, this structure, again, we had several, I think 1, 2, 3, 4 trees in here, and then the rocks and boulders. So kind of making a fish ladder of sorts up through here. And so bringing the bed elevation up toward what we assumed was the historic elevation or close to it, and then reconnecting side channels. And again, This structure it just looks like dirt and rock, but there's a ton of trees in here. So we're kind of making a brick basically of this thing. And again, reducing the slope and reintroducing a little bit of meander.
I wanted to, I'd like to pipe in that
Sure.
these are really massive looking structures, and they are, but it really is necessary because of the stream power that Brian and his team, when they did the HEC-RAS model, they just were dealing with such high velocities that you had to do both substantial structures and provide the side channel, sort of that floodplain reconnection to really, work effectively.
But we're also really trying to emulate what was historically there too. I mean, it's kind of hard to emulate an old growth tree, an 8-foot, 9-foot diameter Doug fir. But you can do that by increasing the number of 20 and 30 inch diameter trees, and so again, a lot of the studies that we did, or I did in my earlier career on the west side of the Cascades, usually you're looking at streams like this had about 300 pieces of wood greater than 12 inches in diameter. So anyway, this is another look at kind of the side channel 3 area. And it's really to this photo on the left is the before. So kind of a lot of angry water, kind of looking downstream. And then this is the same basic photo point and really changed the character. So I don't think we manipulated any of these rocks, but it gives you an idea of how high we did bump up and reintroduce the flow. So kind of angry water to now kind of kind, gentle, and happy. Kind of similar, this is around side channel 2. Again, this is looking upstream here. So I can't remember the slope here, but it was well over 4%. And then the series of structures again kind of really mellowed out. And yeah. Cindy and I were talking earlier today, and this is kind of a big pool area, but by the end of this winter, a good bit of this will fill in. And if our models are correct, there should be a fair amount of spawning gravel in these pool tail crests. You'll still have a pool, but it will not be this extensive. So basically this riffle will extend down to here to some degree, and you should get a big pool tail crest spawning area through.
Yeah. I liked Darcy just shared a comment about the pool's good for fish and humans, swimming for humans as well. Not that we know anything particularly specifically or personally about that, but just saying these pools are really nice. Actually, Brian, if you'll go back, I just wanted to describe a little bit some of the monitoring we're doing. So we're doing a few key things for pre and post project monitoring, and it's been really exciting and kind of just satisfying to work with all the partners in the basin to compare notes on the the restoration effectiveness monitoring that we've been doing, and just kind of fine tune it a little bit so that everybody is collecting the same thing, so we can help each other out with pre and post project monitoring. And so one of the things that we're doing is looking at changes in substrate size or rock size in the channel. And the technical term is a Woolman pebble count, and which is really a fancy term for measuring 100 pieces of substrate of rock in a given cross section. So where we did these pebble counts on this project were associated with the kind of the downstream end of these bigger pools that were created from the structures. And so we're anticipating that, sort of right after construction, so we know exactly where to do the measurement. And you can see sort of this, you can see somebody in the on the left-hand side of the post-construction photo. And so this is in the process of doing our pebble count and walking across and looking at you know, the first thing that your finger touches, you know, every step across the first size of sediment your toe touches or your finger touches across the stream. And so what we found here was there was a lot of fine material that was, you know, that's there because of the construction activities. And then also larger, you know, larger rock. And what we're after is the slightly smaller, the gravel, the spawning gravels that Brian just talked about, and this sort of the spawning size cobbles. And so we do anticipate that after a good winter event, could be this year, could be in a few years, maybe even in 10 years, that will get these spawning gravels kegged up behind on the up, you know, just kind of right at these structures that have been put in. And then the other thing that we're looking at pre and post project is we go up the stream channel, and Darcy and Alex and Catherine Arndt and I and Patrick, I think we even roped him in his, when he first started, into some of these pre-project surveys on the West Fork. And so you look at the photo here on the left, and it's steep, a lot of boulders. This is pretty much all what we call riffle habitat, very few pools. And then what we're going to find post-project is a lot more pools, a change in sort of the average depth overall, a change in, you know, so a change in the kind of stream habitat that a fish is experiencing. So I think in the next couple of years, we're going to be presenting to you some of the changes that we've actually seen and measured from all of these projects that we've been working on. Okay, Brian, thanks.
Sure. So this is just a shot of, also when we were in the side channels, we took the opportunity to go ahead and areas where there are depressions, there were obviously pools in the past. We went ahead and kind of reconstructed those and added a lot of wood and complexity and habitat. This is down at the lower end of the side channel. And absolutely the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and where would we be without BPA, Bonneville Power Administration, and last but certainly not least, aquatic contracting. They've done really great work and did a great job on this project. With that, do you have any questions?
And we do, and I just want to also, the tribes, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs was a project partner, but then also provided through their BPA funding there, really was a major funder of the project, in addition to the Forest Service providing wood and staff. Brian's time. Thank you to Brian. I know you don't usually thank yourself, so I'm going to thank you, Brian, for it was amazing to work with you, and we learned. I know Alex and I learned a lot.
Yeah, you guys were really a pleasure, and Darcy, thank you, and definitely Catherine. Like I said, made our jobs pretty easy, and it was really a pleasure working with you guys. Hopefully we can do some more.
That sounds like a plan. So we've got some questions in the chat box. So Nate asked if we could compare and contrast the site selection, restoration goals, and design approach from last month's projects on Neal Creek. So compared to this one. So that's a good question. I can take a stab at it. So very huge difference in these sites. Neal Creek is all on private property, and there is a lot of infrastructure, and by that I mean roads and houses and other buildings in the 100-year floodplain. So we were much more limited on what we could do. And in fact, we really couldn't we could not raise the level of the 100-year floodplain, the base 100-year floodplain elevation. And because of that, you're really limited in what you can do. You don't, I mean, I think that the design engineer and the team did a great job with what we were able to do. But nothing like, the aggressive, we were actively trying to create more flooding, and we couldn't create more flooding on Neal Creek. So we had to create habitat complexity, but kind of dialed down compared to what we were able to do on the West Fork. That being said, what was similar about the Neal Creek site and this site is that they both had a high amount of intrinsic potential for fish. So the Neal Creek section did have some opportunity for floodplain reconnection. We just had to do it in a way that didn't overall raise the flood elevation. But they both sites inherently had good potential for improving, fish habitat in Steelhead and spring Chinook. And then the design approach, similarities in the design approach, we did utilize HEC-RAS in both cases. This was the West Fork project was very much conducive to fitting in the field. There was a little bit, we could sort of respond to what we encountered in the field. The aquatic contracting main operator, who has implemented he's been the operator for all of these West Fork projects. So he had a really good feel for building, and he's worked with Brian, for a number of years. So you have more flexibility in that situation for Brian and the operator to kind of respond to what they're seeing as they're going, with the design as a guide and sort of total amounts of removal and fill as a guide. And let's see, so Brian, do you want to add anything to that? Or Alex, do you want to add anything to that? That was like a really complex question, Nate. But it was good.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I would just say it's a really good question and a really good representation of how these projects vary and how we still are able to reach our goals and address some of these limiting factors for salmon and steelhead in our watershed, in a private landowner infrastructure type reach versus a open playground like the Forest Service land. And so it's just a different challenge, but ultimately similar results, maybe just different scale. But good question. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, the only thing I'm not familiar with Neal Creek, but we did a project on the other side of the hill on the Zigzag River. At the same time, we were doing Red Hill, and that too was in a FEMA floodway. Now, we also had cabins, infrastructure, Highway 26. So the level of risk was astronomically higher, to say the least, than Red Hill. However, we were able to work with FEMA and the Corps of Engineers, and we were able to pop up certain sections of the river to activate some of the old historic floodplains. It was a little easier on Zigzag just because they used more levees there. So in a lot of the cases, it was just to remove sections of the levees and abracadabra there. But yeah, I think the whole point is, your risk are commensurate with the level of design and your implementation and your engineering. So.
All right, next comment and question. So from Jonathan Terhar, who admires and appreciates your work, Brian. His question is, all things considered, what is your confidence level in regards to whether wild winter steelhead have a chance in the Hood River, especially looking at historic escapement trends being well below the necessary 1,500 spawners deemed as required by the fisheries managers, and given hatchery steelhead we'll know. And also given that hatchery steelhead won't be spawning in the hood in a few years. You have a
Jonathan, I wish I could be really optimistic, but I'm just going to be flat out and tell you what I know is pretty grim. I still have quite a bit of connections with the Wind River folks, and we've been monitoring both adults and juveniles with a series of adult traps and juvenile traps for over 20 years. And right now, the Wind River fish that are coming over, the latest WFW data is between 40 and 60. It's more toward the 60 end percent of the pit tagged adults that come across Bonneville are not getting to the Wind River. And that's not good. So we need to get a handle on some other things. And it's, you know, we can do all we can with freshwater habitat, but if the fish aren't getting back to where they need to spawn, then, you know, it's not a real optimistic view. I wish I could give you sunshine and kittens and rainbows, but it's pretty ugly.
any other questions? And you don't have to type them in the chat box. Feel free to, and actually, Brian, you could go ahead and close the presentation. Much as I believe this is your dog, right?
Yeah, and she's kind of acting up right now too. Hopefully you can't hear her. So.
But if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free to do it that way as well. All right.
So, no questions?
I have a quick question. Brian, can you tell us about the river behind you?
Oh, that was a project I did last year on the Trinity River. And it was mined back at the turn of the century. And I got to work with awesome group, the Hoopa tribe and Bureau of Reclamation and others. And we actually reconstructed about a mile of the main stem Trinity River. And yeah, it was a big project. And I got out of there before the smoke got really horrible.
Thanks. You have some crummy work environments. I'm sorry for you.
Well, I'd love to take you to Weaverville sometime. You see how wonderful that place is.
Okay.
All right, Nate had another quick question: how we identified this reach of the West Fork for implementation, and that really gets back to the intrinsic potential mapping. That high intrinsic potential for salmon, like spring Chinook and steelhead spawning, is largely driven by how broad the floodplain is that you could, even if it's disconnected, what's the potential floodplain width? So there's some parts of the hood that where the valley walls are pretty narrow. There's just not a lot of intrinsic potential to reconnect or to improve. Like you could put structures in there, but they'd get blown out because there's no way to kind of reconnect. There's no floodplain to easily reconnect. And also gradient, like the steepness plays a role in intrinsic potential. So this area had a high intrinsic potential and a need for ecological uplift. And in our strategic action plan, you can see maps of intrinsic potential for both steelhead and spring Chinook. And so that just pops right. You can really see there's places in the watershed that are kind of hotspots for medium to high intrinsic potential. So that was a big reason, that was a big driver of how these areas were narrowed in on. And Darcy had a comment that which we did forget to mention. So during the excavation of side channel 2 entrance, thank you for bringing this up, Darcy, because I feel like there were a few things that we forgot to put in. was it was this huge berm that we had to get through. And when we were walking around over a year ago and kind of brainstorming what things might be possible at this site, it was just like this really big berm. And I think most of us, except Brian, at first we really thought Brian was crazy, right? Because he was like, oh yeah, let's just like take all this out. And it was just like, oh my God, that's a huge pile of rock, Brian. And so we, but they did the modeling, and you could really see it really looks like, the river used to go here. So like, why is there this huge rock, band of rock here? And we were thinking maybe it was past Lahar from, some kind of a outwash from the, the Elliott or Ladd Creek, or no, am I getting, yeah, Ladd Creek, Ladd Glacier, that might have been why there's this huge rock pile there. And then the operator was digging through it. And meanwhile, the Forest Service did have their archaeologists on site, because they were kind of curious to, in some of this major excavation, whether anything of historic value would be unearthed. And what we were finding is all of this old cable, and then got down to a point right at the entrance of side channel 2, where there was this like a stump, and it wasn't a cut, well, it was a cut stump, right, Brian? It was
Yep.
sort of, it was cut, but basically the archaeologists concluded that this was actually that was a location of a splash dam. Like they had constructed right at the entrance of side channel 2 used to be a dam, a splash dam. And so that explained this big pile of rock, not that it was laid down naturally. So it was really satisfying to remove that pile of rock, because we were literally removing this old splash dam buttress and letting the river access that historic floodplain again. So thanks, Darcy, for pointing that out. And chime in, Darcy, if there's anything else you want to add about this, about the project that we haven't mentioned or thought about. You can unmute. Let's see your face.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Cindy. And sorry, my lighting is really poor right now. I thought it was really interesting to just get some corroboration that there's all the splash dams and berms in there from the historic logging. And then also wanted to add that we've implemented 2 additional projects in connection with this reach. So it's a contiguous reach with a 2016 and 2017 implementation. So, from the 3 different projects, we're really getting a nice long reach of connectivity of better habitat for fish species in that area.
Yeah. Thank you, Darcy. All right. Looks like
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I think this is the point where we show ourselves or unmute, and we give a big round of applause or thumbs up for our great speakers and the project as a whole. It was very, very great. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right, well, listen, happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanksgiving.